Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Truth Med. I'm Dr. G, and it has been a long time, hasn't it? For those precious few of you who have been with me from the beginning and have seen some of my earlier videos, you know that it has been about a year since I've made a video, and I am so sorry for that lapse in time. I'll get into some of the reasons why that happened a little bit later, but for right now, I'd like to tell you about our topic for today, which is the COVID vaccine. It's a controversial topic, I know. It shouldn't be a controversial topic, but it is. And we'll get into some of the reasons why it is. And we'll talk about how it works. We'll talk about how well it works or doesn't. We'll talk about how safe it is or isn't. And we'll go into some of the history and philosophy. And we'll try to cover everything so that you have everything that you need to know, because this is an important topic, right? I mean, this is something that impacts your health. And depending on what you believe, and honestly, regardless of what you believe, it is a matter of life and death, or it can be depending on the situation that you're in. So it's very important, and we all need to understand it, and we all need to make informed decisions. So we'll be talking about all that. But I want to be very, very clear right from the beginning here that this video is for everyone. So if you don't like vaccines, and I mean, let's say you're an anti-vaxxer, that's okay. You are welcome here, and there's something for you here because there are reasons why some people don't like vaccines, right? If you're an anti-vaxxer, you know what those reasons are. And we'll talk about that a little bit. And on the other hand, if you're someone who's already gotten the vaccine and you wish other people would get the vaccine, well, this is your video too, because we'll talk about some of the reasons why people feel that way and why the vaccine can be a good thing. Um, but the long and short of it is we're going to stick to the truth. That's why I call it Truth Med. Everything I'm going to be giving you is the honest to goodness truth. I'm not going to mislead you. And everything's going to be based on data, not on some guy's opinion, not on public official's opinion, not on a public health representative's opinion, not on Fauci's opinion, not on the president's opinion, not on the former president's opinion. It's going to be based on data so that we can really get to the truth and so that you have the information that you need to make a decision. Okay? Now, I know you might say, okay, but why Dr. G? Why does this guy, why should I listen to him as opposed to all the bazillions of other people out there who have an opinion on COVID? And like everybody has an opinion on the COVID vaccine, right? And it's a totally fair question and it deserves an answer. And some of that has to do with why it has taken me so long to make this video and why it's been a year since I made my last video. And that's basically because for the past year and a half, all I've done is COVID. I've been too busy to do anything else. And the reason for that, in turn, is because I am a board certified internal medicine physician and I have specialized in hospital medicine. I'm what's referred to as a hospitalist. And some of you know what that means. But for those of you who don't, um, let's say that you go to the emergency room because you have some sort of acute illness. Maybe you have an infection, a pneumonia. Um, Maybe you have a urinary tract infection. Maybe you have a blood clot. Maybe you're having a heart attack. Maybe you're having a stroke. Maybe you got in a car accident. Anyway, when you go to the emergency room physician is going to assess you and they are going to stabilize you and they're going to start your treatment. And then they're going to make some triage decisions and they're going to decide, can this person go home and be treated as an outpatient? Or is this person too sick and they need to go into the hospital, to the ICU, or to the medical or surgical ward? Um, and if the answer is they need to be an inpatient, they need to go into the hospital, then they give somebody like me a call, a hospitalist. And we come down to the emergency room and we talk with you and we do an examination and we look at all of your laboratory data and all your past medical history and we get to know you and we try to really delve in there deep and get to know everything that we can about you so that we can give you the best, most tailored care to you that we possibly can. And we look at all your imaging studies and we talk to other experts to make sure that we're doing everything the way we should. And then we scoop you up and we get you into the hospital and then we take care of you there until you are better and it's time to go home. That's what a hospitalist does. And as you can imagine, for the past year and a half, hospitalists have been doing COVID and COVID and more COVID. That's not all we've been doing. I mean, people still have heart attacks, right? And they still have strokes and they still have small bowel obstructions and they still have other things. But a lot of it's been COVID, so much COVID. And um, because of that, those good doctors out there, and there are a lot of good doctors out there, have been studying really, really hard to make sure that they know everything they can possibly know about COVID. So when COVID first became a thing, the first thing I did was go, oh boy, this looks like it's going to be really big. I better be prepared. So I started reading everything I could get my hands on about COVID. And I'm not talking about like reading articles from MSNBC or Fox News or CNN or something like that. I mean, yes, I looked at some of that too, but I'm talking about the data that came out from trials. I'm talking about observational studies, case studies, and of course, the pinnacle of scientific information, these large multi-center randomized placebo-controlled double-blinded trials. That's really, really good information. And of course, at first, we didn't have a lot of that information. We just had scraps of information, but everything I could get my hands on, I was reading it and rereading it and trying to make sense of it and putting that together with everything I was hearing from colleagues around the world and really trying to figure out exactly what this new bug is and what it can do and what it can't do and really put it all together. And as time has gone on, we've gotten more and more and more data. Now there's a flood of data. Now it's like I spend hours a day reading and I still can't quite read it all, but since the beginning, that's what I've been doing. And that's what a lot of other hospitalist doctors out there have been doing since the beginning of all this. Um, and that's who you really want to guide you through this because, again, it doesn't really matter what somebody's opinion is. It matters what the data tells you. And you need somebody who can decipher that data and has access to it and can put it together for you and make some sense of it. So that's why listen to a guy like me. It doesn't have to be me, but listen to a guy like me that has that history and that experience. And there's another side of this too. There's a very personal side to this because um, some physicians, not all physicians and not all hospitalists, but some people have been very fortunate, like myself, to be able to, first of all, I've been able to travel around the country. Earlier in my career, I traveled around the world doing international medicine. And that was such a gratifying and wonderful experience to be able to help in other parts of the world. But with COVID, I've gotten to travel around our country, my own country, and help out in places that were really hard hit by the pandemic. And so you get to see it from different angles and from different places. And this has been a hard one. I've spent time looking into the eyes of someone right before they go on a ventilator, and they're scared, and they need someone who will pray with them and hold their hand and tell them, you know what, we've got you. It's going to be okay. And then we put them on a ventilator, and it's touch and go, but most of the time we save their lives. And occasionally we lose somebody, and you have to be ready for that too. And that's been very hard. It's been especially hard because a lot of the time patients haven't had their family members with them. And so we have had to become their family. The nurses and the doctors that work with these people, we've had to become their family because their family couldn't be there because we were so worried about other people getting sick with this. And I have opinions about that too. And that's something for another day. But the point is, this has been really important, and this is what we've been doing for the past year and a half, and I want to tell you all about it. All right, so this, as you've probably noticed already, this is going to be a longer video, and I'm sorry about that, but there's just no way to do this in 5 or 10 minutes. It's going to be a longer one. So by all means, take breaks when you need them, put it down, come back to it later. I totally understand, but let's get this thing done. Okay, so let's get started. So let's start with just a little bit of history and philosophy. This won't take long. I'm going to throw a term up here. I know that might be a little hard to see, but homeopathy. I'd love to say, by show of hands, who knows what homeopathy is? But of course, I can't do that. So, but some of you out there know what homeopathy is, and you see a homeopathist or a homeopath. And this is a different tradition of medicine than so-called modern medicine or Western medicine, what I practice, which is Western medicine or modern medicine. Um, Homeopathy is a little bit different. And if you look at the root of this word, homeo or homo means the same. Think homosexual or homo sapiens, and there's homeostasis. There's lots of different examples, but it means the same. And pathy or pathos means disease or the state of not being well. And so essentially, you have the idea here is you are treating the disease with something that is the same as the disease. Or in other words, you're treating the disease with the disease. You're fighting fire with fire. It might sound a little bit strange, but it's a recognized tradition in medicine. It's not modern medicine. It's not Western medicine, but there are people who practice this. And interestingly enough, if you happen to be an anti-vaxxer, statistically, there's a decent chance that you see a homeopathist. Um, and these people can be helpful for certain things. But what I practice is a little bit different. What I practice is I practice allopathy. I'm an allopath. And anytime you see that someone is an MD, I'm an MD, they are an allopath. And allo means different. So these are opposites. Here, you're treating the disease with the disease. You're treating it with itself. Here, you're treating the disease with its cure. You're treating the disease with its opposite, with its cure, the thing that fights it. Um, and while this one has become the mainstay of our modern medical society, this is where most of the regulated medicine is. When you go to a hospital, this is what happens to you. There are both of these traditions. Now, these aren't the only ones. There's also osteopathy, and this means bone. And so diseases of bone, or you're treating bones. It just depends on how you look at it. This is actually what DOs are. So if you happen to go to a doctor who's a DO or an osteopath, then that's this. The reason they're called this is because osteopaths, if you go back a ways, they used to primarily treat things by manipulating the body, by doing essentially chiropractic. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's the basic idea. Um, but today, osteopaths and allopaths are basically the same thing. Okay, they get the same kind of medical training. The only difference is with osteopaths, you get a little bonus. You actually learn some chiropractic, whereas you don't with when you learn allopathic medicine. So in a way, they've actually got a little advantage. This I'm an MD, but I actually wanted to be a DO, but life didn't work out that way, so I'm an MD. But anyway, these are roughly the same in how they practice medicine now. And then you also have naturopathy, E. You have naturopaths who, of course, treat disease with natural cures, right? So you can kind of get a sense for different traditions in medicine. This is the predominant force in medicine today, but it's not the only one. And the reason I bring this up is because some people are a little distrustful of this, right? Some people are a little distrustful of modern medicine or Western medicine, and they want to go to something that's more natural, or they want to do something that's in a different tradition. And but interestingly enough, when you're talking about vaccines, vaccines are homeopathic medicine. They're not allopathic medicine, they're homeopathic medicine. They are treating the disease with the disease. I mean, essentially, when you give a vaccine, you're giving a small dose of the virus to a person, either an inactivated form of the virus or a killed form of the virus, a dead form of the virus, or you're giving a piece of the virus to a person, and then their body's immune system recognizes that as a foreign thing. It builds an immune response, and now you're ready for when the actual virus comes in. And so you're treating the disease with the disease. You're fighting fire with fire. You are using homeopathy. And isn't it interesting that some of us distrust this and do this, but hate vaccines, even though vaccines are quite possibly the best thing that has ever come out of homeopathy. And I mean, really, homeopathists should be taking credit for this because vaccines have saved millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of lives. I mean, it's just ridiculous how many lives vaccines have saved over the course of generations. And so it's a really big deal, but it doesn't come from the allopathic tradition. And so we get a little confused. We think, well, I really like this and I'm really against this, but it turns out if you really look at it, maybe not. Maybe it's a little bit more confusing than that. It's a little bit more complicated. So sometimes I think it's interesting to look at these sorts of things. But anyway, enough of that. Okay, now let's talk a little bit of history, okay? Oh, interestingly, desensitization therapy is another example where homeopathic medicine really shines. Desensitization therapy is when someone has a really bad allergy. Let's say they have an allergy to aspirin, but they really need an aspirin because they've got bad coronary artery disease or something like that. Um, Essentially, you can give somebody a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of aspirin, so small that it won't hurt them even though they're allergic to it. And then you give them a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more. And the body slowly adapts to it and becomes desensitized to it so that the immune system doesn't go bonkers and make them have an anaphylactic reaction or something like that. That's called desensitization therapy. And it's not done all that often, but it is done occasionally in modern medicine, but it comes from the homeopathic tradition. So again, we just need to be aware that there's all these different schools of thought, and when things are working the way they should, they all blend together and they work together to help people. And when things are not working the way they should, they sort of fight against each other, which is not the way it should be. Okay, a little bit more history, and I promise I won't take a whole bunch of time here, but this is important. These are things that you need to know and that some of you will want to know. So let's talk about some of the historical reasons why some people don't like vaccines. So if you're an anti-vaxxer, this is your moment. So there are actually quite a few instances that have happened in the past across the world with regards to vaccines where things have gone wonky and haven't gone the way that they were supposed to, and bad things have happened. But one of the more famous cases in the United States was called the Cutter incident, and people who are really diehard anti-vaxxers probably know all about this. But essentially, this was a case where we took a virus that we wanted people to have an immunity against, and we inactivated the virus. In other words, we sort of killed the virus so it can't hurt you anymore. And then we inject that virus into people, and your body recognizes the virus. Even though it's dead, it recognizes it and says, okay. It's kind of like if you give a bloodhound, the a piece of clothing that someone was wearing and they sniff it and they're like, okay, okay, I've got it. And now when I find the actual person, I'll be ready. Well, in this case, you're giving them a little bit of a clue, and the immune system says, okay, I've got it. And then when you are exposed to the live virus, the one that will actually hurt you, your body's ready. And so it takes care of the virus. That's the idea. In this case, oops, some of the virus wasn't inactivated. And so we ended up giving about, I, I want to say it's about 40,000. I might be wrong. That might be the wrong number. Please don't quote me on that. But I want to say it's about 40,000 people received the live virus instead of the inactivated virus, which means basically we just intentionally made them sick. And not just sick, but we made them sick with the very thing that we were trying to avoid making them sick with. Um, and of course, because this is what we do whenever we make mistakes in the government, we try to what? Cover them up. And so that just makes everything worse because it all comes out eventually. And then what happens? Trust erodes, right? We don't trust anymore because man, you said you would take care of us and you didn't. Um, and these things happen. And these are the reasons why people get really twitchy about these things. It's not really because vaccines cause autism, because guess what? They don't. If you look at study after study after study after study, vaccines are very, well, good vaccines that have been approved by the FDA are very, very safe. And the risk that you will acquire something awful from a vaccine is vanishingly low. The FDA wouldn't approve it otherwise. And so it's not that vaccines do all these horrible things. They really don't. What it really is that we have a collective memory of the times when the government has made a big mistake and has hurt us and then tried to cover it up. And that's why we don't trust vaccines. And the Cutter incident wasn't the only one. There's also the simian virus incident, and this was where people were given a vaccine, large number of people were given a vaccine, and unbeknownst to them, included in that vaccine was a simian virus. And thankfully, it looks like that virus doesn't hurt people. It looks like that, in other words, nothing horrible happened as a result of this, but it could have. And it feels awful, right? When you hear that, oh, what? You gave me some virus? You didn't mean to, but you accidentally gave me some virus that you don't really know what it's going to do to me. That makes me really freaked out. Um, and so, again, these things erode the collective trust that we have in these institutions. But again, it's not because the science is bad. It's not because the idea is bad. It's not because the concept doesn't work. It's because we're human and sometimes we screw up. And when we screw up on a big scale, on a governmental scale, and then we try to pretend that we didn't screw up, but it comes out later, that hurts, doesn't it? And then ouch, we don't want to do it anymore. Okay, but now let's talk about some good history because there's good history out there too. So, okay, now let's talk about some good history. So, believe it or not, vaccines in some form or another have existed at least as far back as around the 1500s, where in China, um, an emperor of China, and I don't remember the name, um, used basically smallpox, took, it's really gross, took scabs off of smallpox victims and ground them up into a powder and then blew that powder into the nostrils of healthy individuals. And I know that sounds really, really gross and it sounds very unscientific and it sounds like you're not getting, what is the dose right? Who knows? And that's all true. But it seemed to work. And again, the idea is you're giving a small amount of the virus in hopefully a weakened form because that person's immune system had already been working on fighting that virus. And you're giving it to somebody else so that their immune system will overcome it, but in doing so, it will recognize it and it will then be ready when it has to face a strong version of the virus coming later. But much more compellingly, if you happen to be an American citizen, um, believe it or not, one of our founding fathers, George Washington, none other than GW himself, he mandated that the Continental Army, this is the War of Independence, 1775, 1776. He mandated, remember, we're talking about that now in our society right now. He mandated that the Continental Army be immunized against smallpox. And you have to remember, smallpox was killing people by the gajillions, and it had been for hundreds and hundreds of years. Remember when the conquistadors come over from Europe and they land in the Americas, and by some estimates, 90% of the Native American population was killed by smallpox in the ensuing decades after the arrival of the Europeans. I mean, it's a devastating virus. It's way worse than COVID. Um, and so George Washington, smallpox is still around at that time. George Washington demands that smallpox, um, that all of his Continental Army be vaccinated against smallpox. And again, this is very unscientific. They're essentially taking a person who has smallpox and they have lesions on their skin and little pustules, and you get a stick or a piece of metal or something, and you scoop up some of that pus and guck, and then you jab it into somebody else. And in doing so, you hope that you've given them just the right amount, not too much, not too little, um, so that they will have an immune response against that virus, and it might make them sick, but it won't kill them, and they will then be ready for a strong version of the virus when it happens to them later. Now, if people had already had smallpox in their life, then they didn't have to do this, but those who did not had to do this. And so George Washington, one of our founding fathers, mandated that the Continental Army do this. And in doing so, helped win the Revolutionary War because his troops then weren't getting sick from smallpox and the British troops were. And isn't that just absolutely fascinating? But some of this history about smallpox in particular comes from the fact, I don't know if any of you have ever heard the phrase, it's an old phrase, it's old fashioned. I grew up on a farm, so I've heard it. You may not have heard it, but if you've heard the phrase, fresh as a dairy maid, this is an old saying on farms. I mean, you don't really hear it now, but it came from the fact that dairy maids seem to have smoother, nicer skin than everybody else. Well, why did they have smoother, nicer skin? Well, it's because they didn't get smallpox, or at least if they did get smallpox, they didn't have a horrible version that either killed them or left them scarred, because smallpox had a tendency to leave people very scarred and disfigured. And dairy maids seem to avoid this fate more often than not. And why was that the case? Well, it turns out that dairy maids were exposed to another virus called cowpox. And cowpox is very similar to smallpox. They come from the same family. And so if you've had smallpox, your body is, and smallpox doesn't make you terribly sick, thankfully, um, then your body has been prepared to fight off cowpox, but it also is prepared to fight off smallpox because they're so similar. And so dairy maids would essentially be relatively immune to smallpox. Hence, they would have good skin. Hence, they are fresh as a dairy maid. So you can see how all of this plays together way back before people knew how to isolate viruses and how to make vaccines in a lab. All right, so we have seen some examples of where vaccines have gone wrong. Cutter incident, simian vaccine, that didn't go well. But we've seen some examples of where the vaccines have saved the day, like with smallpox. And recognize that with smallpox, we took a vaccine, or we took a virus that was ravaging the world and had done so for centuries, at least as far back as the 900s and probably back before that. So millennia, really, the smallpox has been ravaging the world, and we've eradicated it. It doesn't exist anymore. We've I mean, this sounds bad, but we've committed genocide. We've wiped out a virus, a species from the face of the earth. The only place it exists now is in government laboratories where it's totally safe because no one would ever do anything bad with a virus from a government laboratory. Not so sure how I feel about that. But anyway, aside from government laboratories, it doesn't exist anymore. Vaccines took away this virus that was killing hundreds of millions of people year after year after year. That's an amazing accomplishment. But you do have to recognize that smallpox, in the smallpox battle, we had a couple of advantages because smallpox, first of all, is a very stable virus. It doesn't mutate very much at all. And all viruses mutate, okay? All viruses mutate. When they are replicating their genetic code, when they're making copies of themselves, little mistakes get made, and those mistakes represent mutations. And most of the time, the mutations are bad for the virus, and the copy that has the mutation dies. But every once in a while, a mutation comes about that actually helps the virus adapt better to its current situation. And so it's made it stronger in that environment. And this is what, okay, so all viruses mutate, but all viruses are not created the same, and so some mutate much more than others. For example, HIV mutates like crazy. So does hepatitis C. But other viruses are much more stable. Smallpox was a very stable virus. It didn't mutate a lot, and that's important because if you're going to make a vaccine, you want to target this virus. But if this virus mutates into something else, then maybe your vaccine doesn't work anymore. It's trying to hit this thing, but it's over here now. Um, and that's not necessarily true with all mutations, but it can be true. And if something mutates a lot very quickly, then vaccines become less effective. So that's one of the things that we have to take into consideration. And so smallpox was very stable. That helped us out. What's the other thing that helped us out with smallpox? Well, smallpox doesn't have a lot of vectors. And by vectors, we mean ways in which it spreads. And specifically, um, different animals through which it can spread. And so smallpox was just a human virus. It wasn't present in cows and turkeys and other things that we rub shoulders with all the time. And so, and that's very important because if we eradicated it in humans, then it was just gone. But lots of viruses have other vectors. So they don't just infect humans, they infect cows and they infect donkeys and they infect horses and they infect dogs and cats. And so even if you eradicate it from the human population, it's still in the animal population. And that means that, once you get rid of it here, it's just going to pop back over. Now, that doesn't mean that vaccines aren't useful. They're still very, very useful. It just means that you can't stop vaccinating. And so with smallpox, we were able to give everybody the vaccine, eradicate smallpox, and we're done. Boom. We don't ever have to do it again. But most of the time, that's not going to work. Most of the time, we have to keep giving people the vaccine. And what are viruses that fit that category? Well, there's a whole bunch, and you probably have been vaccinated against a bunch of them: polio, measles, um, pertussis, whooping cough, and there's tetanus. There's other examples besides that. These are examples of things that um, we have very, very, very effective vaccines for, and they keep us safe from some of these really awful infections. I mean, tetanus tetanus is very rare in America now because we're all vaccinated, but every once in a while somebody doesn't get vaccinated and then they get tetanus. And I've seen a case of tetanus, and oh my gosh, you do not want that. That's awful. It's terrible. So it's wonderful that we're protected, but we're protected because we get vaccines when we're babies and then as we're children and growing up. And that's how we avoid getting some of these viruses. And we've been very successful. The vaccine programs have been successful in getting rid of a bunch of viruses that used to kill us all the time or cause a great deal of mischief anyway. So some viruses can be eradicated completely. Some can't be eradicated completely, but they can be eradicated from the population as long as you continue to vaccinate. And that's how this works. But what's an example of a vaccine that that doesn't work all that well. Well, let's look at influenza. Influenza. I want to be very, very clear. I'm not saying that you should not get your flu shot. You should. If you get your flu shot, you will, on average, be less ill than a person who doesn't get their flu shot. And that's just math. It's just statistics. Okay. I could go into all the nitty gritty details, but that's not what this video is for. But if you get your flu shot year after year, you will be more healthy and less ill, statistically speaking, than a person who doesn't get the flu shot year after year. Okay, so I'm not saying don't get it, but it's not the best vaccine. And why is it not the best vaccine? Well, because influenza mutates a lot. And so it's always changing. And so we build a vaccine that covers influenza and then it says, nope, I'm over here now. And so then we build one for here and nope, I'm over here now. And then, we're dancing all around. And that's why we have to get a vaccine year after year after year, because which strains of the virus are active every year change. And it changes from year to year and you have to change with it. And you might say, well, what's the point? Why get a vaccine if it's just, especially because, sometimes vaccines give people, they make them a little bit sick. What's the point? Why get sick just so that you can not get sick? Well, there is a point because, first of all, as you are exposed to a vaccine, you will lose your sickness to it. In other words, you will desensitize. So when I got the first flu vaccine that I'd ever gotten, my first flu shot, I got kind of sick. I had a little bit of a fever. I felt kind of achy. I didn't feel all that great. Now, I didn't get the flu. The flu is awful. I mean, sometimes people say I had the flu, but really they just had a cold. When you have the flu, you have high fever, 104. You feel like a truck ran over you. You don't want to get out of bed for 4 days. The flu is awful. So being able to get a vaccine that makes you feel a little ill so that you don't get the big illness, that's a good deal. But here's the great thing. The very first time I got my flu shot, yeah, I felt a little poorly. Next year, not as bad. Next year, not as bad. Next year, nothing at all. And ever since then, I've not had any reaction whatsoever. And that is typical. That's usually the way it works. Now, everybody's different and not everybody has the same experience, but most people will lose the symptoms to a vaccine if they take it regularly like they're supposed to. And meanwhile, it will keep you from getting sick as often. Now, some people will point out, well, the flu vaccine doesn't always protect you from getting the flu, right? And that is true. This is why it's not the best vaccine out there. It's still worthwhile, but it's not the best vaccine. Um, because you can still get sick with influenza with the flu vaccine, but you are much less likely to. And if you do get the flu, you won't be as sick. Is this starting to sound familiar, like with COVID and stuff? This is how this stuff works. So if you've been getting your flu shot year after year, you're unlikely to get the influenza at all. And if you do get influenza, you'll get a watered down version of influenza that's not as bad. And so it's well worthwhile doing. But having said that, if there's one vaccine that you're not going to take, maybe influenza would be the one. I'm not saying don't get it. You should get it. You'll be healthier if you do. But it's not the best one out there. There are better vaccines. All right, now let's talk about the COVID vaccine. Okay, now let's talk about the COVID vaccine. And remember, I'm specifically talking about the messenger RNA or mRNA vaccines that are produced by Pfizer and Moderna, which happen to represent, in my opinion, the best vaccines for COVID that exist on the earth today. Um, there are other vaccines out there to be sure. I mean, there were many, many, many companies that were all across the world that were racing to make a vaccine for this thing. And most of them failed to achieve what they were going for. Either the vaccine was unstable, or it caused too many side effects, or it wasn't very effective at preventing the virus. Most of them failed. Okay, it's only the ones that made it to the finish line that we're talking about. And Pfizer and Moderna's messenger RNA vaccines are really the pinnacle. They're the ones that not only made it, but they made it really, really well. And they're very, very effective. Now, I know one of the things that bothers people is how are they so effective so fast? How? Because these things are supposed to take years and years to develop, right? So, how do we magically get it done in like a year? That seems spooky. That seems like something shady was done, right? Well, no. And the reason is this. First of all, did we cut corners? You betcha. We cut every corner that we could safely cut. And so you have, for example, at the Pfizer plant, you have government money being pumped into Pfizer, and Pfizer is using that money to have people working 24/7, not one person working 24/7, but they hired more people so that they could have shifts so that people were there 24 hours a day, which normally they don't. Normally they work just during business hours, but because this was so important and it needed to happen fast, they had the workers there 24/7, and that allows you to get stuff done faster. And that's just an example. There were other ways that the wheels got greased as well, and those are ways that you can safely get things done quicker. But you might say, yeah, but there are some corners that you just can't cut. And you are correct. So how did we get it done in a year? Well, the answer is we didn't get it done in a year. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that we had been working on the vaccine for the coronavirus for literally decades, or almost 2 decades anyway. If those of you who remember SARS, SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, that was a coronavirus that came out about 2002, 2003. And medical providers like me were worried about that one because it looked like it was going to make a big splash. It looked like it could possibly be like COVID was. But thankfully, it fizzled, and it definitely hit, and it definitely caused trouble, and people lost their lives to it. But it wasn't big on the global scale like COVID has been. But we were worried enough about it that we started to make a vaccine for SARS. And then a little bit later on came MERS, MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. That's also a coronavirus. And it also gave us a scare, but then kind of fizzled. But again, we thought, ooh, we need to be ready because one of these coronaviruses is going to be the big one. And so we're working on a vaccine for it. Now, it is true that you can't really put the finishing touches on it until you know exactly what strain of the virus you're going to be dealing with. But all the groundwork, all of the really hard stuff was already done. It had been done from 2002 to 2020. So it didn't get done in a year. It got done in 18 years. And that's how the miracle happened. Okay. I know it seems sketchy, but it isn't. It's just that we had been working on it for a long time already, and we were very lucky that we had been working on it. Um, and so when it came about, we put the finishing touches on it. Now, we did ultimately cut a corner that is important, and that is the last part of our big phase 3 clinical trials. Like, you would like to have years of data that show just how safe and effective this vaccine is. The problem was people were dying in the tens of thousands all the time around the world from COVID. We didn't have the luxury of having years. And so we had to make a call. It was a difficult call, but we had to make a call. And what was decided is that we're going to take the vaccine that looks to be very safe and looks to be very effective. We feel pretty good about it. We're not 100% sure, but we feel pretty good about it. And we're going to introduce it to the population. So we essentially become the phase 3 clinical trials. And I know that sounds bad, but it's really not if you take a step back. So when I got the vaccine, I got the vaccine all the way back in December of 2020, right when it first came out. I was a healthcare provider. They offered it to me, and I happily took it. Now, did I take it just because I have faith in humanity? No, I took it because I looked at the data, because Pfizer was releasing its data bit by bit, week by week. And at that time, we had not a lot of data, but we had a very short period of time that was very, very, very promising. And in that time, and I'm forgetting the exact numbers, but it was something like the people who had received the vaccine, 9 people got COVID out of thousands of people who were in this arm of the study. Thousands of people got the vaccine, and 9 of them got sick. On the other half, this is the control side. This is the placebo side. So these are the people who didn't get the vaccine. 169 people got sick. So in the same period of time, same number of people in the groups, everything's matched, everything's paired, everything's blinded. But in that short period of time, you had 169 people get sick in the control and 9 people get sick in the vaccine. That's pretty striking. And from that, they calculated that number that you heard in the media, 95% effective. Now, should they have made that claim? Honestly, in my opinion, no. I think they jumped the gun a little bit. They really wanted to assure the public, and in doing so, they actually eroded trust a little bit because everybody knew that it was too quick for them to really be able to say with a great deal of certainty. For me, it would have been better if they'd said, you know what, we don't have a lot of data yet, but the data looks really, really promising and it looks very effective, but we can't give you a number yet. I would have accepted that. Um, but they said 95%, but they really didn't have enough data yet to really say that, right? Because as time goes on, maybe that number shifts. Maybe it's not 95%, maybe it's less, maybe it's more, who knows? Time will tell. And so, but nevertheless, we had that data, and that data was good enough for me because meanwhile, on the safety side, it was very, very safe. Out of the thousands and thousands of people who received this, there were very, very few serious reactions. Now, there were some, okay? Again, this is TruthMed. I don't want to lie to you. There were some adverse reactions, and there were even some deaths, but there were no deaths that were clearly linked to the vaccine. Because you have to remember, if you give 40,000 people a vaccine and then you give it a little bit of time, some of those people are going to go and get hit by cars and they're going to die. But that doesn't have anything to do with the vaccine, right? So there were some deaths, but there weren't any that were clearly linked to the vaccine. And the number of deaths was very, 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 very small. So it looked, and the number of serious reactions that didn't result in death, but that were nonetheless something that you wouldn't want to have, were very, very small. Not zero, but very, very small. So I looked at that data and I said, okay, looks pretty safe, looks really effective. I'm going to do it. And so I signed up in December of 2020 and I got my vaccine. And I'm so glad I did. And did it make me sick? Yeah, it made me sick because this is all brand new, right? My body's never been exposed to this coronavirus before. And so I got sick. But that's okay. In fact, it's good because that means my immune system did something. It recognized the foreign material in my body and it reacted and it started to form an immune response that will then be there if I get infected with the actual virus. So I'm protected, and that's wonderful. And then on my second dose, I got sick again. Both times it lasted for about a day. Both times it wasn't the end of the world. Both times it was way the heck better than getting actual COVID and dying, right? Now, I know you could say, well, yeah, but I'm not gonna die if I get COVID, right? Because the mortality rate's about 2%. Well, it depends. It depends on who you are. If you're a young, healthy person, yeah, your risk is pretty low. In fact, let's say you're an 18-year-old who has no health problems whatsoever, your risk is actually lower than 2%. It's not zero, but it's lower than 2%. So yeah, you could roll the dice, but even if it's 1%, or even if it's less than 1%, do you really want to take the chance that something will kill you? Or you could get the vaccine, which won't kill you, and it will make sure that you then don't die from the vaccine. But let me back up. What do the numbers actually show? Well, the numbers, because now it's not just a little bit of time. Now we've had months, right? The vaccine came out in December of 2020. It's now October of 2021. So we now have 10 months worth of data, or 11 months. And man, it has performed really, really well. The Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine have performed really, really well. And it turns out that from the original strain of COVID, that 95% number was pretty close, pretty darn close. In fact, it's probably about like 96. Um, so that means that if you were exposed to the virus and you otherwise would have gotten sick, now there's a 95 or 96% chance that you won't get sick. That's pretty darn good. Um, that's great as far as vaccines go. And what's even better, if you are one of the 4% that's unlucky, you acquire COVID, but you're probably asymptomatic. The vaccine is still protecting you. It's making it more likely that your illness will be less severe. So maybe you just have no symptoms at all. Or maybe you're really unlucky and you do get symptoms, but they're mild because you had the vaccine. It's helping you. Now, are there people that truly, truly, truly got the vaccine and then got COVID and died from it? And the answer is yes. Again, TruthMed, I'm not going to lie to you. The answer is yes. But the odds are roughly, and after all my computing and looking at all the numbers, the bottom line is it's roughly 1 in a million. Okay? It's not exact, but it's about that. 1 in a million is your odds of getting COVID after you've had the COVID vaccine and dying of COVID. And incidentally, your odds of dying from the vaccine, we don't know what the actual rate is because we don't know that the vaccine has actually killed anybody. But if we take the people who have died after receiving the vaccine, and they may have died of something totally different, but if we take that number and we look at it, guess what? It comes out to about 1 in a million. So basically, if you get the vaccine, your chances of death are 2 in a million. One from the vaccine and one from getting COVID after you've had the vaccine. 2 in a million. Those are really, really, really good odds. Now, what's your odds of dying if you don't get the vaccine? Well, eventually, when you get COVID, and I know you're going to say, well, I'm not going to get COVID. Well, you will eventually because COVID's going to be around. It's not going to go away. So eventually, you're going to get COVID. And overall, the risk is about 2%. That's 2 in 100. 2 in 100 versus 2 in a million. I mean, it's just math. It's so much better to get your vaccine. If you get the vaccine, I mean, the odds are astronomical that anything bad is going to happen to you. If you don't, it's 1 in 50. That's a pretty good odd. I mean, you would never let your daughter go drive a truck if you knew that the odds were 2 in 50, or sorry, 2 in 100, that she was going to get in an accident and get killed that day, right? There's no way you would let her do that. You would, no, you're staying right home where it's safe. And that's what you're talking about with COVID. It's a 2% chance. And of course, the older you are and the sicker you are, that number goes up. The younger you are, the healthier you are, the number goes down. But overall, it's about 2%. Now, what about the Delta variant? How does that factor in? Well, the Delta variant it is more contagious. And so the vaccine is a little bit less likely to keep you from getting COVID, but it still does work. And it still works pretty darn well. It doesn't work 95% well, but it works pretty darn well. And again, even if you do acquire COVID, the vaccine will protect you from getting symptoms. If you get symptoms, it'll protect you from having severe symptoms. If you have severe symptoms, it'll protect you from needing to be intubated. If you get intubated, it'll prevent you from dying. You know, it's going to help you every step of the way. It's so worth doing, and it is so safe. And that is from the numbers. That is from the data. That is not from some public health official that I heard. That's not from the former president. That's not from the current president. That's not, it's from the data. This vaccine is very, very safe. It's very, very effective. And again, I'm talking about the Pfizer and Moderna messenger RNA vaccines. Johnson and Johnson a little different. I don't want to talk about that right now. It's actually a good vaccine, but it's, in my opinion, not as good as the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. Um, so that gives you some idea of how safe and effective they are. Okay, guys, I know this has been a really long video, and thank you so much for hanging in there with me. I'm going to close now, but really quick before I do, one more statistic. Um, if I know you've all heard, well, why should I get the vaccine if even healthcare providers are mixed on how they feel about the vaccine? Okay, is that true? Well, here's the numbers. So the number of nurses who got the vaccine willingly without anybody twisting their arm and wanted to get the vaccine was about 70%. That is actually a shockingly low number to me. And I'm a little bit, that hurts me. I think, oh my gosh, we haven't done a good enough job educating our nurses. And they deserve that, and we should have done better. But if you go to doctors, if you go to the people who really, really, really know the data, and that's our job. Our job is to know all the data and to process it and to make sense of it and to figure it out. What are the doctors? What have they been doing? 97%. So if you're a doctor, you know that this vaccine works. It's a good thing and you should go get it. So trust this doctor. This is a good thing. Get your COVID vaccine. It it'll make a difference. And remember, it doesn't just make a difference for you, it makes a difference for everybody around you. You create a web of safety around you for other people because remember, some people can't get the vaccine, or like, for example, I have a brother-in-law who's got a kidney transplant and he's on immunosuppressive medications to make sure that his body doesn't reject that kidney transplant. Those immunosuppressive medications mean that he is much more likely to get infected and get sick with coronavirus. It also means that the vaccine doesn't work as well for him. And so we got to protect people like him. They need protection. And the way we protect them is getting vaccinated so that all the people around him can't get infected. And if we can't get infected, then we can't pass it on to him. And so he's protected. That's the herd immunity concept. Okay. So I hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions, comments, please leave them in the links below. I'd be happy to address them. And as always, guys, remember, get out there and make the world a better place day by day, step by step. We've got to do it together. Okay. Um, I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye.